There's a character in a story about a war that destroyed her family who finally finds the man who killed her mother, alone, defenseless, entirely at her mercy, and doesn't kill him, not because she forgives him, not because she's suddenly at peace. She has every tool, every reason, and every right to end his life right there, and she chooses not to use any of it. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. You've probably wanted to hurt someone at least once for something that didn't come anywhere close to what was done to her. And you didn't even have the power to follow through. You just carried the wanting around for years anyway, like it was doing something useful. Her name is Katara, and today you're going to find out what she understood about restraint that you, with far less at stake, still refuse to understand. Think about the last time you replayed a confrontation in your head, the one where you finally said everything, where the other person finally understood how badly they hurt you, where you got to be the one holding the power for once. Most of those confrontations never actually happen. They just live in your head, on repeat, doing nothing but keeping the wound open a little longer every time you visit it. Katara's version of that fantasy actually happens in real life, with real power behind it. And what she does with it is the part almost nobody expects. Before she became one of the most powerful waterbenders in the world, Katara was a young girl in the Southern Water Tribe, in a village stripped down to almost nothing by 100 years of war. Most of the men gone to fight, most of the resources gone. An entire tradition of waterbending, nearly wiped out by raids, meant specifically to make sure benders like her could never grow up to fight back. She wasn't raised in comfort. She was raised in scarcity, in a community constantly bracing for another raid, learning early that safety wasn't something you could count on staying in one place. Hold on to that context because it shapes everything else. The compassion and restraint you're about to watch her show later in the story didn't come from a life where nothing bad ever happened to her. It came from a life that had already taken plenty, and somehow didn't finish the job of hardening her completely. There's a version of this story where scarcity and constant fear simply produce a harder, colder person by necessity. Someone who learns early that softness gets you killed and adjusts accordingly. Katara doesn't become that. She becomes the group's caretaker instead. The one who worries about everyone else's well-being on top of her own. The one who steps into a maternal role at an age where she should have still been allowed to be a child herself. Scarcity shaped her into someone more attentive to other people's pain, not less. That's not the typical outcome, and it's worth noticing before the story asks even more of her later. When Katara was very young, a raid hits her village, soldiers searching specifically for the last waterbender of the Southern Water Tribe, because a bender left alive is a bender who might grow up to fight back. Katara's mother Kaya realizes what they're looking for and does the one thing she can to protect her daughter. She tells the soldiers that she's the waterbender they're looking for. She isn't. She lies directly to their faces to make sure they take her instead of her daughter. They kill her for it, right there in front of her family. Katara grows up with that image, not just the loss of her mother, but the knowledge that her mother's death happened specifically in her place. A sacrifice made deliberately so that Katara could keep living. That's not an ordinary grief. It's grief with a debt attached to it, one that never fully goes away, no matter how much time passes. Have you ever carried a loss that came with that kind of weight? Not just sadness, but a sense that someone gave something up specifically for you, and you're not sure you'll ever be able to live up to what that cost them. Most people never have to carry anything close to that. And yet plenty of us still nurse resentment for years over far smaller things, treating them with the same permanent, unshakable weight. There's a specific complication in grief like this that makes it harder to process than ordinary loss. Katara isn't just mourning her mother. She's carrying the knowledge that she is, in some direct sense, the reason her mother made the choice that got her killed, not through any fault of her own. She was a child, but the fact remains lodged in her mind, regardless of fault. That kind of grief doesn't just ask, why did this happen? It asks, was I worth it? A question with no satisfying answer, one that most people carrying survivor's guilt never fully resolve no matter how much time passes. The identity of the soldier responsible stays a mystery to Katara for years. Not forgotten, never forgotten, just unreachable. She grows up, trains under waterbending masters, becomes one of the most skilled benders in the world, travels across every corner of it, fighting in a war her mother died trying to protect her from, and the entire time, some part of her is still that girl standing over her mother's body, wanting to know who did it and why. Eventually, later in the story, she gets a real lead, a name, a description, a way to actually track the man down, and she doesn't hesitate. She sets out immediately with Zuko, of all people, someone from the very nation responsible for her mother's death, accompanying her, because by that point, even he understands what unresolved grief like this can do to a person if it never gets a chance to be faced directly. You know what it's like to want an answer so badly that finding it becomes its own kind of mission, a name for the vague ache you've been carrying, something concrete to finally point the anger at. Katara wants exactly that. And what she gets, once she finally finds him, isn't what either of you would expect. It's worth noticing who she chooses to bring with her on this search. Zuko, someone whose own family started the war that killed her mother, someone she distrusted deeply for most of the story up to that point, becomes the one person she allows to witness this. Not because she suddenly trusts the Fire Nation, but because Zuko is the only person in her life who understands firsthand what it feels like to be consumed by something you can't let go of. She doesn't need someone to cheer her toward revenge. She needs someone who's already walked the road of chasing an obsession and can recognize, better than anyone else around her, what she's actually walking into. When Katara finally tracks down the soldier, a man named Yan-Ra, she doesn't find the fearsome, armored killer she's been picturing for years. She finds an aging, pathetic man living a small, unremarkable life with his own mother, someone who flinches and grovels the moment real danger shows up in front of him. He doesn't offer a justification worth anything. He doesn't even seem to fully register the weight of what he did. He minimizes it, deflects, tries to blame circumstances and orders instead of taking ownership of the choice he made. The monster Katara built up in her memory for years turns out to be, in person, small and cowardly, in a way that almost makes the whole confrontation feel anticlimactic. This is a detail worth sitting with, because it happens to people constantly in smaller versions. The person who hurt you badly, who you've built up into a towering permanent villain in your head for years, is very often, in reality, someone smaller and more pathetic than the myth you've been carrying around. That doesn't make what they did smaller. It just means the confrontation you've been dreading or craving rarely looks the way you imagined it while you were only picturing it from a distance. There's a specific kind of disappointment built into this that nobody prepares you for. You spend years building a villain worthy of the size of your pain, someone whose defeat, whose suffering, whose comeuppance would finally feel proportional to what they took from you. And then you meet the actual person, and they're small, diminished, barely able to look you in the eye. The size of your grief and the size of the person who caused it were never going to match, and Katara has to absorb that mismatch in real time, standing right in front of the man responsible, with no villain grand enough to make the confrontation feel like it settles anything. Here's where the story puts Katara in a position almost nobody ever actually gets to be in: complete, undeniable power over the person who caused her worst pain. Yan-Ra is unarmed, terrified, entirely defenseless in front of a fully trained master waterbender who has every physical capability to end his life in seconds, with a storm gathering around her that makes the threat unmistakably real. Nobody would have stopped her, not narratively, not morally, not in any sense the story sets up. She has the power, the provocation, and arguably the right. This is the moment the entire story has been building toward, the confrontation between grief and its cause, with nothing standing between them. And she stops, right at the edge of it, with the power fully raised and the man fully at her mercy. She stops herself. Think about how rare that actually is. Not the desire for revenge, which is common, almost universal, but having genuine, total, unstoppable power to act on it and choosing, in the moment itself, not to use it. Most of us never get real power over the people who hurt us. We fantasize about it precisely because we know we'll probably never have to test whether we'd actually use it. Katara gets tested, for real, in the most literal way the story could construct, and passes a test most of us will never even have to take. There's an honest question worth sitting with here, uncomfortable as it is. If you'd actually had that kind of power over the person who hurt you the most, not the fantasy version, But the real, undeniable, nobody would stop you version, are you certain you'd have made the same choice Katara does? Most people assume they would, because in the fantasy, they always play the version of themselves who shows restraint, who's better than the anger. Katara's story is uncomfortable precisely because it strips the fantasy away and asks the question for real, with real stakes, and still lands on restraint, which suggests the answer isn't as automatic as most of us assume it would be for ourselves. This is the part of Katara's choice that gets misunderstood the most, because people assume that not killing someone must mean forgiving them. It doesn't, and Katara makes that distinction explicit. She tells Yan-Ra plainly that she isn't going to forgive him. Not that day. Maybe not ever. The anger doesn't evaporate the second she lowers her hands. She still holds him fully responsible for what he did. What she refuses isn't the anger. It's letting the anger decide the rest of her life for her, specifically whether she becomes someone who kills a defenseless, unarmed man in cold blood, no matter how much he deserves consequences for what he did years earlier. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story because it dismantles a trap a lot of people fall into, the belief that you either have to fully forgive someone or you're obligated to make them pay for it with everything you've got. Katara shows a third option most people never consider, holding someone fully accountable in your own heart, refusing to pretend it's okay, and still choosing not to let your worst impulse toward them define who you become. Can you hold that same distinction in your own life? Accountability without forgiveness, anger without destruction, or do you assume that if you're not going to forgive someone, you're somehow obligated to make them suffer for it in whatever way you still can? This distinction is worth applying to something much smaller and more common than murder, because most of us never face anything close to Katara's situation, but plenty of us face a miniature version of the same false choice. Someone hurts you badly enough that forgiveness feels impossible, maybe even wrong. And because forgiveness feels off the table, the other option quietly becomes some version of punishment, cutting them off publicly, telling everyone your side until their reputation matches your pain, holding on to the grudge as if maintaining it is itself a form of justice. Katara shows there's a third door most people never try, fully refusing forgiveness while still refusing to become someone's punisher. You can hold both "I don't forgive you" and "I won't spend my life making you pay for it" in the same hand, without either one canceling the other out. It would be easy to read this moment as effortless, as if Katara simply realizes killing him isn't worth it and calmly walks away. That's not what happens. She's shaking. She's furious. The storm she summoned doesn't just disappear the second she decides not to strike. It takes visible effort to bring herself back down from that edge. This matters because it separates restraint from indifference. Katara doesn't spare Yan-Ra because she doesn't care enough to want him dead. She spares him while wanting it badly, in the moment, with every physical capability to make it happen. The restraint isn't the absence of the impulse. It's holding the impulse at full strength and still refusing to act on it, which is a far harder, far more exhausting thing to do than simply not caring in the first place. You've probably confused calm with restraint before, assuming that if you're still angry, you haven't really moved past something. Katara's story argues the opposite. Real restraint often happens in the middle of the anger, not after it's gone. Waiting to feel calm before you choose not to lash out means you might be waiting your entire life, because the anger in cases like this was never going to fully leave on its own. This is worth naming plainly, because it's the exact thing that trips most people up when they try to apply restraint in their own lives. They wait to feel ready, for the anger to cool down enough that not reacting feels easy. It rarely works that way. The moments that actually test your character are almost always the ones where the anger is at full volume, not the ones where it's already faded into something manageable. Katara doesn't get the luxury of restraint being easy. She has to choose it while every part of her is still screaming for the opposite, which is exactly what makes the choice mean something. After she lowers her hands, Katara doesn't get a tidy resolution. Yan-Ra doesn't face some grand justice in front of her. He doesn't apologize in a way that finally means something. She simply leaves, with the man who killed her mother still alive, still unpunished by her own hand. The debt from that night still technically unpaid by anything she personally did about it. This is the part of restraint that's hardest to sit with, because it doesn't come with the satisfaction of closure most of us secretly want when we imagine confronting someone who hurt us. Katara walks away carrying the same grief she walked in with, just without the added weight of having become someone who kills a defenseless man in cold blood. The debt from her mother's death doesn't get settled. She just refuses to let settling it cost her something she'll never get back: who she is. That's a specific kind of loss most people never account for when they fantasize about revenge. You imagine the moment of confrontation solving something, providing an ending. For Katara, the confrontation doesn't end anything. It just clarifies once and for all which version of herself she's willing to become in order to try to make it end. Most revenge fantasies are secretly built on the assumption that the act itself will produce relief, that hurting the person back will finally quiet whatever's been sitting unresolved for years. Katara's story quietly argues against that assumption before it ever gets tested, because she never gets the closure the fantasy promises, and neither, in most real cases, does anyone else who actually goes through with something similar. The ache doesn't disappear because the debt gets collected. It just changes shape, and you're left carrying a different weight instead. The weight of what you did to try to make it stop. Now, forget about Katara for a second and think about you. Think about who you fantasized about confronting, about finally having power over, about watching squirm the way you've imagined for years. A boss who humiliated you and never faced consequences. A partner who betrayed you and walked away unscathed. Someone who hurt someone you love and never paid any real price for it. Katara had total, real physical power over the person who took her mother from her, with a storm at her command and every justification the story could possibly offer, and she still chose not to use it in the worst way available to her. And you, with power that rarely extends past a cutting comment, a cold shoulder, or a grudge you nurse in private, have probably still let the fantasy of making them pay cost you more peace than it's ever bought you back. You've held on to anger not because it protects you, but because letting it go feels like letting them win. The exact same trap Katara stood right at the edge of and refused to fall into. Think about the version of making them pay you've actually been running for years without calling it that. The story you tell about your ex to anyone who'll listen, engineered to make sure they come out looking worse than you. The silence you maintain with a family member specifically because you know it bothers them more than it bothers you. The satisfaction you feel imagining them finding out how well you're doing without them. None of this requires a storm or a water-bending master's power. It just requires you to keep feeding a version of justice that isn't actually making anything better. It's just quietly deciding, one small choice at a time, who you're becoming while you wait for a debt that was probably never going to get paid, the way you're imagining. Katara isn't restrained because the loss didn't hurt enough to justify revenge. It hurt as much as loss can hurt. She's restrained despite having, for one specific moment, everything required to act on that pain in the most permanent way possible: the power, the provocation, and a story that would have justified it completely. You don't have to forgive anyone today. You don't have to let go of anger you're not ready to release, or pretend some old wound doesn't still ache exactly the way it always has, just because you watched a video on YouTube. But maybe you can start by asking yourself, honestly, what version of making someone pay you've been quietly holding on to, and whether keeping that fantasy alive has actually been protecting you, or just quietly deciding who you're allowed to become while you wait for a debt that might never actually get paid. There's one more thing worth being honest about before this ends, because it's tempting to walk away from a story like this. Thinking restraint means you'll eventually feel okay about what happened. Katara doesn't. She never says the loss stops hurting, never pretends the man in front of her deserved anything less than her fury. What changes isn't the size of the wound. It's her refusal to let the wound author the rest of her story. That's a smaller, harder, less satisfying version of peace than the one revenge fantasies promise, but it's the only version that was ever actually available to her, and probably the only one that's ever actually available to you either.